Hi, I'm Ari, I'm the Oak Witch, and today's video I'm going to be going over what is witchcraft. I didn't really know what to call this video, and I apologise if the intro is different to the actual title because I still don't know what to call it. But this video was inspired by a comment I got on one of my TikToks. Before you say anything, don't shame me. Yes, I'm on TikTok now. But the comment I received on one of my videos where I was showing this book that I got in the mail recently, and I was going over basically the contents of it. And they talk about the Cunning Folk in here. And then they also separately talk about witches. And one of the comments I got was, weren't the Cunning Folk witches? And my answer was, no, they weren't. But it is slightly nuanced, and I realised that I've never actually done a video on this channel explaining what is actually witchcraft. So that's what I'm going to do today. Also, a side note, my experience, my research background is British witchcraft. I can't really help it. That is where I live, I practice British folk magic, so that is the background I have. So just wanted to put that disclaimer. I'm going to talk about witchcraft more broadly, but when I'm getting into discussions about history, it's going to be from a more British lens. When we're getting into definitions of what witchcraft is, you're going to find that over time it has had different definitions, and the modern witchcraft definition is very different to how you would historically define it in Britain, for example. So the definition of witchcraft that I like to use is a practice of magic, this magic being based in a folk magic tradition, the use of divination, the idea of connecting to your local land, your environment. I think spirit work also defines witchcraft. And the one thing which I think separates witchcraft from other magical practices is the use of spells and ritual. So these things combined, I think, get a good idea of what witchcraft is, what we do, and some of the underlying core beliefs that we may share. However, modern witchcraft that is practiced and as we know it today is secular. And I mean secular in a way that it doesn't necessarily come with a specific set of religious beliefs attached to it. However, I would argue that there are some underlying spiritual beliefs that come with being a witch. For example, the belief in magic or the belief in spirits. And obviously for a lot of people's craft, their religious beliefs are heavily ingrained in their witchcraft practice, and that's completely valid. But I guess what I mean to say is you can practice witchcraft with any religious background. Realistically, you can have any moral or philosophical or religious beliefs. When approaching the craft, it doesn't come with a expected set of religious beliefs. So that ties into also witchcraft being a very personal journey. If we're gonna look at history, witchcraft hasn't necessarily been really distinct from religion, nor has it really been separate from the devil, much to many witches' dismay. I will talk about that in a second, but I want to talk about Wicca at the moment, because if you're gonna start talking about modern witchcraft, what it is, you're gonna have to look at the roots of modern witchcraft, and thus you're gonna have to talk about Wicca. Online, I see a lot of people nowadays being very quick and adamant that their witchcraft is completely separate and distinct from Wicca. And I think sometimes massively separating them is a little misguided. That's not to say that I believe people are actually just practicing Wicca, because I don't believe that's true. Thorn Mooney has done some good videos on this, which I'll link. Oh my god, I can't remember. I'll link there. I think it's there. I'll link it. But I think she explained it really well. Before this eclectic witchcraft, which you see online quite a lot, came Wicca. So what influence did Wicca have? Well, it pretty much birthed modern witchcraft. For those who aren't really aware of the history of Wicca, there's an essay by Julia Phillips, which I really recommend. I'll put it linked below. It's just a really good summary of how Wicca was developed from Gerald Gardner. So Gerald Gardner was a man born in 1884 and he died in 1964. He was an English civil servant who spent a large majority of his life in the East. And from what I've read, he came back during the war and he went to go live in Dorset. And this is where his claims of being initiated into a ancient witch cult or hereditary line of witches that have dated back before pre-Christian Britain. This is where those claims came from. Of course, whether you believe this claim or not is up to you. There's a lot of debate about it, there's a lot of discussion about it. Yeah, that's a whole different video really. But Gerald Gardner also was a naturist. He was also a member of a lot of different ceremonial traditions like the OTO, the Ancient British Church, Ancient Druid Order. I think he was involved in Freemasonry as well. Again, Julia Phillips's essay kind of goes through this history a lot. So this is where you can kind of see the ceremonial influence of Wicca coming from. And though Gerald Gardner created Wicca, it wasn't just him who was responsible for how it came to the public eye, how it sort of formed this idea of modern witchcraft. Names such as Doreen Valiente, which may be familiar to you, she essentially wrote Gerald Gardner's Book of Shadows, and she was a very prolific writer, and there's a lot of lovely poetry that she did, which a lot of people use and borrow nowadays, and you see it quite a lot on the internet. We have Raymond Buckland, who brought it to the United States. We have Alex and Maxine Sanders, who were Gardnerian initiates, but they formed Alexandrian Wicca, and that in itself has been a completely different branch of traditional Wicca, of which Janet and Stewart Farrar, they were Alexandrian Wiccans, or are Alexandrian Wiccans, and they were very prolific in their writing. They wrote this book, which is a pretty popular book. Of course, there's Scott Cunningham, who was another prolific writer. I have a bunch of his books. But he was quite influential in helping Wicca go from this initiation-only closed practice to a solitary open practice that anyone can practice Wicca. Also, I guess to add in Aidan Kelly, who added in those names for the Wheel of the Year. That's where those came from. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of people who made Wicca what it is today, or at least just helped it form to how it is today. And there's so many names I'm missing, but if you want more information about the history of modern witchcraft, I recommend reading Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton. This isn't a book that I've actually finished yet, but it's one that I sort of frequently go back to reference and stuff. He's a good writer and a very respected author, so a lot of people recommend this as well. It's a pretty staple read. Just a really brief explanation of Wicca for those who don't really know what Wicca is. So Wicca is a form of pagan witchcraft. Hence my comment before about separating religion and witchcraft as a little bit misguided, because the roots of modern witchcraft are of pagan witchcraft, Wicca. Of course, modern witchcraft isn't inherently pagan, and actually, as a term, witchcraft now encompasses magical practices that you can see all across the globe from many different cultures. People are adopting the term witchcraft and using it to explain their magical practice relating to their cultural magic, which I'll explain in a little bit, but just going back to Wicca for a second. So if we're going to look at Wicca and the underlying beliefs shared amongst Wicca traditions, it is this idea of the god and the goddess. There are many different traditions of Wicca now, and Wicca has expanded so much, as you know, you can sort of see in my explanation. It's expanded so much in that it looks very different to different people now. There is this idea of the god and the goddess connecting to these two deities through ritual. Ritual is a big part of Wicca. It's a very ceremonial practice, and there are a bunch of different things which I won't explain to you. Maybe I'll do a separate video on what is Wicca. But if you are interested in being an initiate and looking into traditional Wicca and joining a coven, I recommend Thorn Mooney's book, which I can't be bothered to go up and get, but I'll put I'll put an image here. This is a really good book. It's very comforting and it will help answer all the questions that you may have, so recommend that. At the time of Wicca being formed and, you know, gaining popularity, there was a lot of press about Wicca. Not all of it good, but there was a lot of talk about it, and now there are Wiccans all across the globe. And because of its popularity, I think this is how a lot of people get introduced to the concept of modern witchcraft. Wicca is a gateway for a lot of people. Now, a lot of people use this to say that Wicca is just a phase, and I think that's really derogatory. I don't think that's true. Wicca is completely valid as a tradition still, and many people stick with Wicca, and that's totally fine. That's totally cool. But also for a lot of people, Wicca isn't necessarily the right fit for them, and this is how other traditions of modern witchcraft have formed. Traditional witchcraft, this being separate from traditional Wicca, is something which I think has obviously been influenced by Wicca, as all modern witchcraft has been influenced by Wicca, but a lot of tradcraft paths use this idea of folk magic and old witch lore, stuff that goes beyond before Wicca, and using that as a way to shape your witchcraft practice. Some tradcraft books which I recommend that I've read and quite liked are Old World Witchcraft by Raven Gramercy, Besom, Stang and Sword by Christopher Orapello and Tara Maguire, The Devil's Dozen by Gemma. Anything by Gemma has tradcraft vibes, and The Crooked Path by Kelden, which I haven't read, but I'm bringing this up because we are reading it in our book club that starts very soon, and by very soon I mean probably within the next 2 weeks. So if you wanna join in on book club, come join my Discord server. All of the book club is discussed in there, so yeah, go join that if you're interested. This idea of tradcraft is now this separate section of modern witchcraft, which also goes into folk witchcraft. But if you are interested in folk witchcraft, I recommend reading Folk Witchcraft by Roger J. Horne. This book is so good. It's such a good beginner's guide to just witchcraft in general, to be honest, as I think it kind of gets to the roots of witchcraft, but maybe I'm biased because I'm a folk witch, but anyway. This book, it's not very long and it's quite an easy read, but he goes over basics really well, and I think it's a really valuable book if this is your type of thing. So this idea of folk witchcraft, which I see a lot of people stepping towards more nowadays, but it's this idea of connecting to witchcraft through a folk magic tradition. Now, before I get into that, I want to explain, I guess, what folk magic is. Folk magic is not a singular thing. It's not a singular tradition. Nowadays online, I do see it used in a context where it is this one thing, but it's not. I guess you can have an eclectic folk magic approach, borrowing different folk magic from different cultures. If done respectfully, I don't see that as a huge issue, but emphasis on doing it respectfully. But of course, folk magic is something which is defined by the culture. Folk magic was something that was initially orally passed down through tradition, through family, through mentors. It's not so much that anymore. It definitely still exists. I know that a lot of Irish folk magic is passed down orally and is sort of close to that family tradition. But of course, this is something which isn't public for everyone to practice. It is closed in that sense, and that's completely valid, and people should respect that. But nowadays there is more literature and books about different folk magic traditions, and folk magic is now something which is really accessible to people anywhere. From English folk magic to Appalachia folk magic to Mexican folk magic, there is a whole bunch of literature on different folk magic traditions for anyone to go read and just absorb that knowledge. And I think that's really lovely. I think that's really beautiful. The most important thing to remember when you're getting into a folk magic tradition, which isn't necessarily the culture you're a part of, just do background research, learn about the culture, and just be respectful in the way you approach it. If we're getting into what folk magic in general looks like, it can look like just many different things. I'd say it's categorized by the use of objects, ingredients, charms, amulets, talismans, different spell methods like poppets, sachets. There's a lot of sympathetic magic involved, contagion magic. Different traditions of folk magic will have different approaches. That's why it's kind of hard for me to define, because I don't want to miss anyone out. I don't want to step on any toes or over-explain or under-explain. So it's something which obviously is going to look very different to different traditions, hence why folk magic is not a singular thing. So out the back of this idea of connecting to folk magic, at least in Britain, comes from this idea of tradcraft. Now, this is something that Gemma has done a lot of material on, but this idea of reclaiming the devil as a folkloric figure in your witchcraft. That's why I say it's misguided when people say there is no devil in witchcraft, but yes, there is to a lot of tradcraft witches, and I think that's completely fine, and I think people should acknowledge that more. Also, it's definitely worth considering the Catholic or Christian syncretism in a lot of folk magic traditions, hence why I wanted to make that anti-Christian bias video, because you do see a lot of Christian hate and a lot of exclusion of Christian witches from our community, but they are massively valid, and it also really hurts POC religious traditions. You know, for example, brujeria. So they use the idea of Catholicism in their folk magic, and it is a core part of their tradition, and we shouldn't exclude them from our circles, and that's what Christian hate does. So I think it's worth considering that the separation of witchcraft and Christianity is not as separate as you think. They cross over, and that's okay to acknowledge. So I've spoken a lot, and I'm gonna flick back to the comment that I received. Weren't the Cunning Folk witches? And my answer was no. The Cunning Folk were magical practitioners of the village who people in the village went to for healing, for, you know, detecting thieves, for divination, for things like charming and love magic, but most importantly, people went to the Cunning Folk for action for bewitchment. Now this means they went to the Cunning Folk for help and guarding against witchcraft. Witchcraft here being defined as baneful magic. Now, again, there's lots of debate about, you know, the bias of history being written down by Christians, so witchcraft being defined as something that is baneful, you know, that's a whole other discussion beyond the scope of this video. But this, as we have it in historical accounts, is the definition of witchcraft. Witches back in the day were in leagues with the devil, and they had familiars that they would send to people to do harm. So the Cunning Folk were obviously separate from witches in this regard. I think eventually all magical practices were eventually condemned by the church, so Cunning Folk were labelled as white witches. White and black magic are terms I do not use on this channel and do not recommend to be used because of the racial connotations that comes from the States. But in a lot of different cultures, white and black magic don't necessarily have those connotations, but I still don't like using them. But in terms of, you know, historical books you see on British witchcraft and British folk magic and just general Cunning Folk, they use this idea of white and black magic. But the Cunning Folk were essentially seen as benevolent witches, but they weren't actually witches back in the day. You also get other names like toad doctors and wart charmers and pellers in Cornwall. There are so many different names of so many different types of magical practitioners, and they were all separate from each other as they did different things. There's an article by Owen Davies who explain the differences between the Cunning Folk and wart charmers, and it was really, really interesting. I'll have a link below, but I think it's behind a paywall. I got it through my university, but I'll link it below if anyone wants to read it. Another book which I think is really good for understanding who the Cunning Folk were is by Owen Davies, and it's called Popular Magic, Cunning Folk in History in English folk magic. Oh, I can't remember what it's called, but I'll have a link here. Again, I read this through my university, but it was such a good book, so informative, lots of information there. Really recommend that to get a good distinction of who the Cunning Folk were and why they were separate to witches. So, oh my gosh, I've spoken a lot. Let's link it back to witchcraft and what it is today. So, having explained roughly what folk magic is, rough history of Wicca, and a little bit of tradcrafting, you get to this point of what is witchcraft right now? Witchcraft is something which is hard to define because of these different traditions. So if you're a complete beginner and you don't know where to begin, you know that you kind of like witchcraft, maybe you have a tarot deck, maybe you have a couple crystals, and you're thinking, I want to be a witch, I want to start practicing witchcraft. What I recommend doing is just looking at your country, where you live, your culture, where you're from, maybe your family background. Look at that local folklore, local history of witchcraft, and see if you connect to that. You could get into that folk magic tradition and build your witchcraft practice around that. Now, this is not to say you're completely tied to the country that you live in. That is not the case. A lot of pagan religions, a lot of witchcraft practices and folk magic are open, and you don't have to practice solely from the country that you live in, because one, that's getting into really focused ideas, and we don't support that here. None of that. I just give this tip because I think it can help some people who are just really stuck and don't know where to begin. Start with just the land you're living on, your local environment, the culture that you're currently in, and connect to that, and then see where you go from there. So yeah, a TLDR. What is a witch? A witch is someone who practices witchcraft. This witchcraft can be intertwined with a religious tradition, or it cannot have one at all. It usually looks like practicing divination, practicing spells or rituals, working with spirits, working with your local environment, and practicing folk magic. Those things, I think, pretty much form a baseline of what witchcraft is. Witchcraft now has developed so much over the years and is now an umbrella term in which there are loads of different traditions. You could go through Wicca, and then when in Wicca there are loads of different traditions. You can go through traditional witchcraft, and in traditional witchcraft there are a bunch of different traditions. You can go and incorporate folk magic into your witchcraft, folk witchcraft, in which there are numerous different folk magic traditions. These traditions in themselves can blur over. So ultimately, witchcraft is a personal journey. It's something which you form over a period of time, something which makes sense to you, and doesn't necessarily have to be something which someone else practices. It's something which is unique to you. It is going to be your approach, your experiences, your beliefs, and yeah. I'll stop us there, shall I? I hope that this video has made any sense. I hope that it's helped you get a better understanding of witchcraft and how it's formed and what it looks like today. If you have any questions, please ask below. I'll answer them. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.